Pleasure. All right, let's get started.
Yes. So, Dr. Pigliucci, I wanted to bring you on. Of course, you're known for your work in philosophy and Stoicism. And Stoicism, you kind of have these three tenets that come up a lot. You have the ethics, the physics, and the logic. The ethics, I feel like, are so often talked about. It's kind of the main line of the Stoic philosophy. But the logic is kind of what you use to build the ethics. So, can you speak a little bit to the importance of the logic?
Yeah, let's step back for a second, if you don't mind, and
Yeah,
actually
no.
look at all three of them, right? So the
Mhm.
Stoics did not invent that partition between what they call physics, which really translates to science, because physis in Greek meant natural, natural world, so nature. So it's really science. Logic, broadly construed, meaning not just formal logic, but anything that has to do with reasoning, with good reasoning. And then ethics, meaning how to live your life. Uh, that was a standard distinction of, partition of three fields of philosophy that, was found in at the Academy of Plato, and Aristotle, everything, everywhere. What the Stoics did, however, was they made it a centerpiece of their educational system. So they really built their curriculum, so to speak, explicitly around these three. We find this uh, summarized, for instance, in book seven of Diogenes Laertius, The Lives of the Eminent Philosophers. And the idea was the following: that if by ethics we mean the study of how to live a good life, what you really want out of a philosophy of life, essentially, well, that cannot be done unless you don't reason correctly about things. In other words, logic. And unless you have at least some understanding of how the world works, and that would be the physics, or as I said, more general, the science. Now, the Stoics themselves disagreed about in which sequence you should teach these topics. Some of them started with the ethics, some with the logic, some with the physics. That, to some extent, it's a personal choice. If I were to actually teach in a Stoic curriculum in a school, I would start with logic, because I think that the sound, the ability to reason correctly about things is paramount. Without that, you don't get anywhere. Then you move to the physics, meaning to the science, because you want to have some kind of general understanding, and not only of the world in general, but specifically of human nature. And then finally, you get to the ethics, because the ethics is essentially a triangulation between how the world works and how to think correctly about the world. Now, despite the fact that these were three different fields, of course, in practice, in day-to-day life, you actually use all three of them simultaneously. It's not like you separate things and say, okay, today I'm going to think only about ethics, and tomorrow just about science. So that's kind of the basic idea. Now, you're right. Very often these days, people talk about ethics. Sometimes they talk about Stoic physics, or or Stoic science. Usually within the context of a particular debate that, if you want, we can get there
Mhm.
in a minute. But it's essentially, should you, in order to be a modern Stoic, should you accept ancient Stoic physics or not? That's the question. And my short answer is hell no. Um,
Yeah, because that hinges so much on kind of the Greek philosophical
yeah,
pantheistic that they have.
Yes, I mean it's 2.5 millennia old. I mean, we made a couple of discoveries in the meantime in science. So it would be really silly to say that we have to follow ancient Stoic physics. Although then the question is, if you reject certain important components of Stoic physics, does that have an effect on ethics? Because that is the crucial question. But setting aside that for a moment, you're right. The third one is usually very little talked about. I think is this is for two reasons. First of all, because most people don't like to talk about logic.
Mhm.
It's like, I tried with a friend of mine, Greg Lopez, with whom I do the Stoic camp every year in New York, and we co-authored three books together now. And yeah, every time that we try to sort of say, okay, let's do 10 minutes of, Stoic logic, or even, basic logic, and people eyes glaze over, and like
Mhm.
people fall asleep. I mean, people like logic as much as they like math. That is, not at all, unless they happen to be logicians or mathematicians. So I think that's one reason why people don't talk about it. The other reason is that, frankly, Stoic logic is unchanged since 2 millennia ago, 2.5 millennia ago. Since Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoa, basically put down the major ideas, it hasn't changed. It's propositional logic. It's what's called today propositional logic. It's at the basis of all other more complex logics. It was the most complex system of logic, most advanced system of logic until the 19th century. So until yesterday, basically, in historical terms. And so there's really not much to say. It's like, yeah, it's correct as far as we can, we can tell. It's there is no mistakes there. There's nothing to update essentially, so there's nothing to really discuss. It's just a matter of you need to grasp the elements of logic in order to think properly about about ethics, which is what you really want to talk about and think about. So I think those are the reasons why, on the one hand, the fact that people don't like logic, on the other hand, the fact that there isn't really much to say, at least in the sense of if we're talking about formal Stoic logic. Now, as I said a minute ago, the Stoics thought of logic as in a very comprehensive fashion. It would include also the study of, for instance, cognitive biases and the study of how we arrive at judgments. The famous ascent of impressions and that sort of stuff. That is Stoic logic. I mean, we think of it today as psychology more than anything else, but it is, as far as the Stoics are concerned, that's part of logic. Now, that has improved because, of course, psychology has made some discoveries that, over the last century or so. Although most of those discoveries actually confirm the Stoic intuition about how things work, and therefore, even there's not really much that is controversial. But certainly, the science of logic, so to speak, has improved, and so there is something to understand there and to update.
Right. And if you study logic, you're really going to hear a lot about Aristotle, and that might really be where you start. What does Chrysippus do that Aristotle couldn't? How do their two kind of systems of logic differ?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So Aristotelian logic is actually very simple. It's the simplest kind of logic you can imagine, and that's not to denigrate Aristotle. I mean, he was the first one, the one that got it started, the whole thing. I mean, before him, there really was no talk of formal logic. So all due respect to Aristotle. But Aristotelian logic is very simple. It's all based on syllogisms. It's based on specific terms, the famous PQ, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
Right. So, and it's bimodal logic. It only has two truth values, right? True or false. It has not much else really going. The propositional logic, on the other hand, which is the one that was introduced by the Stoics, who initially borrowed their interest of logic from the Megarians, from another school that Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, attended when he was younger. But then the Stoics really made it into a central aspect of their philosophy, and then with Chrysippus, they really made a lot of advances compared to the Megarians. So uh, Stoic logic is propositional logic, which means, first of all, it applies to full propositions. So things like it is night. If it is night, there is darkness. It's night, therefore there is darkness. That kind of thing. That's more complicated than the simple term logic that Aristotle has articulated. Also, the Stoics were interested in the conditions of truth so-called modality, condition of truth that are uh, broader than what Aristotle was interested in. For instance, the Stoics would say that some assertables, they call these propositions assertables. That is something that or sayables, something you can say, something you can assert, right? Their truth would not be so independent of circumstances. It would depend on, for instance, the time in which you are uttering a particular sayable. If I say, for instance, it is night, That may be true now, but not true tomorrow morning.
Mhm.
Or that may be false now. In fact, it is false now because I'm in New York and it's early afternoon. So it is false now, but it will be true later on. And it was true, of course, last night. So the truth conditions are more complicated, but they also are more applicable to day-to-day life. Again, the Stoics, unlike Aristotle, were interested not in logic for its own sake, but in logic as it applies to our actual problems, in communication and judgment and assent and so on and so forth. So they were clearly interested in figuring out what is it, how standard way of thinking or formal way of thinking about everyday life might actually work or be improved so that we reduce the number of mistakes that we make so that we apprehend truth if it is possible, or at least we estimate whether something is true or not on the basis of proper use of logic. So it's, as I said, so therefore it's more sophisticated and wider ranging, much more wider ranging than Aristotle. Interestingly, throughout the Middle Ages, people were aware of Stoic logic, but most of what was studied was Aristotelian logic. Stoic logic was there, was available. Some people, some of the great logicians of the Middle Ages did bring that in sort of as a tool. But it was pretty much unchanged until the late 19th century, until Gottlob Frege, who is considered often the founder of modern logic, sort of started working. Interestingly, there are some scholars that actually suggest that Frege basically plagiarized the Stoics. Frege was very aware of the Stoics. He had read the Stoics. He knew about Stoic logic, and a detailed analysis of his writings and his annotations clearly seemed to show that he actually lifted a lot of stuff straight from the Stoics. He then went on to, make it more sophisticated and, expanded and all that sort of stuff. So it's not like he just copied. There certainly has been progress, but it's interesting to me that the first significant progress in logic was made possible by somebody who was studying and was very well aware of the Stoics. And it took 2.5 millennia to, in fact, come up with some kind of advance on what the Stoics had come up with.
Yeah, like you alluded to, Gottlob Frege kind of just steals the terms really from Stoic
Yeah.
logic for his own
Mm-hmm.
logic.
Yeah.
I want to move a little bit. You wrote an article a while ago called "Minimalism Isn't Enough," I believe is
Mm-hmm.
about what it was
Yes.
called,
Yeah.
and it was response to your colleague Chuck Trapana.
Yeah.
And basically, it was about this idea we kind of touched upon that Stoicism is incomplete without the logic and the physics. What exactly do you think is not there with just the ethics? What is responsible from the logic?
Right. So Chuck is, I guess, the most prominent modern Stoic who would like to get rid of both the physics and the logic. He doesn't really talk much about the logic, again, because there is not much to talk about. There's
Mhm.
not much to object to Stoic logic. So he doesn't really go into the logic much, but his beef is mostly with the physics. And rightly so, because in the physics, there is quite a bit that need to be changed. The Stoics believe that the universe is a sentient living organism, endowed with the logos. And I'm a scientist. Modern science doesn't present that kind of picture of the universe. So that one definitely needs to go. Now, Chuck's point is that why are we bothering with ancient physics and metaphysics, which we know it's largely incorrect, or at least large chunks of it are incorrect? Why don't you just skip it and then focus on the stuff that really works, which is the ethics? Well, the problem with that approach is, first of all, it has been tried before. The Stoics themselves tried it. Ariston, who was one of the students of Zeno, had exactly the same idea. And at some point, he disagreed so much with his master, with his teacher, that he left the school and went off and established his own school of thought, which died almost immediately. Which means that an approach based only on ethics apparently is not appealing to people. at least historically, is not been appealing to people. So it's not like Chuck's position is new. It's literally almost as old as Stoicism itself. But it doesn't work because the Stoics, as I said before, had this idea that ethics is an empirical discipline, in a sense. We don't, in terms of modern philosophy, modern philosophers, modern moral philosophers don't think of ethics as an empirical discipline. They think that, like Kant, you can just sit down, think really hard, and then come up with some kind of rule that is universal and all that sort of stuff, right? The two modern major frameworks in ethics are Kantian deontology, that is duty-based ethics or rule-based ethics, and utilitarianism, which was articulated by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Both of them are about the same age, meaning that they are late Enlightenment, between the late 18th century, early 19th century. I think they're both mistakes. That is, by comparison with virtue ethics, which was the Greco-Roman approach, they twist things around in a way that it's actually not helpful. They try to make ethics into a rationalistic kind of enterprise, like Kant, or into an enterprise that tries to maximize a single quantity, as in the case of utilitarianism. Both of them are universalists. That is, they both think that ethical problems are of a universal nature, and that ethical solutions to problems are universal. I don't think so. I think that the Greco-Romans got it right, that that ethics is really about how to live with other people in your community, and it's how to develop. And big part of that is how to develop your own character so that you are a decent person when you interact with other people. So it's about your character. It's not about universal rules. Virtue ethics is a situational ethics, meaning that the answer to the question of whether an action is ethical or not is always, it depends. It depends, not in the sense that this is not a call for relativism, for moral relativism, right? It's not your opinion, my opinion, same thing. It's a question of, well, circumstances are complicated. So depending on the circumstances in which the action takes place, also depending on the actor itself, that is the agent who performs the action, the motivations of the agent, the context, the potential foreseeable consequences, and so on and so forth. Sometimes the same exact action is right, in other cases it's wrong. So virtue ethics, I think, is really the way to go. Now, the problem is virtue ethics, not just for the Stoics, in general for the Greco-Romans, is an empirical discipline, meaning that it's based on an understanding of human nature. Right? Let me give you an example. So there is one of the modern virtue ethicists, the most prominent modern virtue ethicist was Philippa Foot, who wrote a number of essays on virtue ethics, mostly from an Aristotelian perspective. One of her books is called, interesting books, is called Natural Goodness, where she articulates this idea, which is essentially the Stoic idea, that if you want to do ethics, you need to understand human nature, because ethics is about human beings being able to live well with other human beings. So it doesn't apply to chimpanzees or to, or snakes or whatever it is. It's about human beings. And so you need to understand what kind of being a human actually is. She comes up with this interesting analogy. She says, imagine you invite me over for dinner and I bring a bottle of wine, but I also bring, as a present, I bring a cactus, a plant. Right? Now you're responsible for the well-being of the plant. And if you don't know much about cacti and you think, oh, this is a plant, so it wants a lot of water and a lot of light, you're going to kill it. Yeah. Because it's a desert plant, not just a plant in general. It's a particular type of plant. It has its own nature, so to speak. And that nature requires, yes, a lot of light, but very little water. If you give it too much water, you're gonna kill it. So similarly, says Foot, when you ask yourself what is the ethical thing to do in the context of human relations, what you're asking yourself basically is, what kind of being are humans and how do they flourish? What kind of things? So whatever is ethical is whatever makes human beings flourish, and whatever is unethical is whatever gets in the way of human beings flourishing. Now we get back to Chuck. So therefore, you cannot do ethics floating, free floating by itself. It has to be connected to an understanding of human nature, which is what the Stoics suggested. And of course, understanding human nature is part of Stoic physics. It's part of science. They also said that you need to have some kind of understanding of the cosmos, meaning the universe at large. Now, we just said a minute ago that yes, but they were wrong about their understanding of the cosmos. They were wrong at a particular, in certain things in particular, right? The universe is not a living organism endowed with reason. However, the basic idea that in order to live well, you need to have to develop some kind of scientific understanding of how things work is still valid. I mean, we just went a few years ago through a pandemic where people died because they misunderstood basic ideas of about viruses and about vaccines, right? So that's what they mean. That's what it means to connect the science with the ethics. That if you're making decisions based on a complete radical misunderstanding of how the world works, you're likely to pay the consequences for that kind of mistakes.
Mhm.
So I don't think it's reasonable to try to detach ethics entirely from science and from logic. Uh, that doesn't mean that the two are, however, tightly connected, rigidly connected. That is, it's not like science. You can you can go into a laboratory, into a biology laboratory, and the biologist is going to give you answers to ethical questions. It doesn't work that way. That would be the case if there was a direct, rigid connection between the science and the ethics. It's more complicated than that, right? So the science informs your ethical decisions, but doesn't determine those decisions. What determines those decisions is a combination of science and logic, right? So it's your thinking through what the science tells you, filtered that thinking through your priorities, your values, et cetera, and then you arrive at answers to the question of, how should I live? How should I act in the world? So I don't think wanting to do the ethics, ignoring the other two components, it seems to me that you just leave this thing floating, free floating in the middle of nowhere. And so when somebody asks you, well, why do you think that action is actually virtuous? You have no answer. I mean, the only answer that Chuck gives is, well, it works. Yeah, but it works according to what criteria? So he's trying to bring in pragmatism, particularly American pragmatism, into this thing. Yes, but you have to have some criterion according to which your answers, your actions work.
Mhm.
And I would say the only criterion that is available is an understanding of human nature. So we're back
And
to the science.
and when you describe it that way, it kind of sounds like the first principles that you need to be a Stoic is the logic and it is the physics. Those are kind of the basis that you build the ethics upon. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. I mean, if we were a completely different kind of animal, right? Let's say a non-social animal, for instance, well, then we wouldn't even need an ethics. There would be no concept. I mean, ethics is about how to live with other people. If you're a member of a solitary species, you don't live with other people. You don't live with other members of your species. It's also thinkable that, but there might be extraterrestrials out there that have radically different natures, meaning that what brings up their flourishing or what impedes their flourishing is completely different from human beings, right? For instance, I don't know, let's just come up with something completely radical. Let's say that there is a species out there that really, really enjoy pains. They thrive only when they're in pain or something like that. Well, clearly then certain actions that would be unethical for human beings would be perfectly ethical for that other hypothetical species. Right? It's because they're so radically different that you would have to change. That contradicts the Kantian imperative, the Kantian idea that ethics is universal, that you can just think about stuff, and then any rational being would agree that the very same things are good or bad. That doesn't hold up. because what is good or bad depends on the details of what kind of species we are. We are a particular, in fact, I will go even further. There is a lot of talk about transhumanism and posthumanism and all that sort of stuff these days. Right now, it's mostly science fiction. There's nothing really concrete. However, we can imagine a future in which human beings actually either through technology, integration of technology, deep integration of technology in our biology, not just wearables like my watch, but literally inside your brain, that kind
Yeah.
of stuff. So either that or a willful redesign of the human genome, right? So a directed evolution essentially by humanity itself, or a combination of those, because those are not mutually exclusive. You can imagine a distant future in which human beings actually control, change their own nature by a combination of technology and direct genetic intervention. Okay, if it turns out that through that sort of interventions and technologies, human nature changes radically, then that would be the end of Stoicism, the end of virtue ethics and all that sort of stuff, because we would be completely different kinds of animals. And if they are completely different, if different things are going to make us tick, so to speak, or they're going to get in the way of us flourishing, then we would have to come up with a different kind of ethics. But until that is going to be, until and if that's going to be the case, we're stuck pretty much with the same human nature that we had 200,000 years ago. I mean, often people ask me, why listen to or pay attention to people that have been dead for 2.5 millennia? And one of the answers to that is because things have not changed much in 2.5 millennia. They changed technologically, right? I mean, imagine if Chrysippus all of a sudden somehow were able to join our conversation via video, right? You would be completely astonished by this. Like, wow, you guys can project images in real time over thousands of miles, that sort of stuff. But then he would settle down and he will listen to what we're talking about, and he would say, "Oh yeah, I know about logic, I know about ethics, I know about all these sort of things that you guys are talking about," because they've really not changed that much in that span of time.
We've kind of, I think, established why to have a Stoic view of the world, logic is very important. But I think, especially in the way that you interpret it, logic is important, but you shouldn't become too, like, not logical, but you shouldn't try and logicalize everything, you know?
Right, right.
You give a quote in that same article where you say, "If I admire the interpretation of a philosophical treatise, I have turned into a literary critic instead of a philosopher. The only difference being that instead of Homer, I'm interpreting Chrysippus." And that's a quote from Epictetus, right?
Correct, exactly. So Epictetus himself realized very clearly that logic is certainly useful, and so is science, by the way, right? But not for their own sake. I mean, the Stoics were nothing if not pragmatic. They went after knowledge that was useful to improve your life. If it doesn't improve your life, then it's curiosity. It's something that you can do in your spare time if you want to, but you shouldn't waste too much time on it. And so in that passage, he's telling his students, you know, don't spend hours and hours and hours trying to interpret the intricacies of Chrysippus. And the reason he picks on Chrysippus is because Chrysippus had the reputation of being very difficult to read. It was very dense and very, it's very, very complex. So like, yeah, but don't spend too much time. Are you learning something from that logic that when you get out of the classroom is actually going to turn you into a better human being? Because if that's the case, then by all means. But if you are just, you know, uh, doing the logic for logic's sake, so to speak, and sort of get lost in the details and the intricacies and all that sort of stuff. But those intricacies and details don't actually change your life. Then what are you doing? Now, there's another passage in Epictetus, however, where he warns his students of the opposite problem, and that is another response to Chuck, if you will. So one of his students apparently said, why should I study logic? As I said before, nobody likes logic. So, clearly, one of his students was, his students were young Roman aristocrats. So it's like, they were coming to school, this guy, and learning about how to live your life. And so one of them at some point says, why should I bother studying logic? And Epictetus' response is, well, would you like me to make an argument in defense of the study of logic? And the guy said, yes, please. And Epictetus says, and how would you know if my argument is correct unless you actually study logic, right? I could be taking advantage of you, pulling one over you because you don't understand logic, so you cannot evaluate my argument. QED, as they would say today, right? It's like, yeah, exactly. So you can see in the discourses very clearly Epictetus striking that balance between now, on the one hand, yes, you do need to study logic, otherwise you're not going to be able to live a good life. But don't spend all your time doing that and not improving your actual life, because otherwise you're just playing around. You're not doing anything serious.
And I think that's a great place to conclude, actually. And thank you so much, Dr. Pigliucci, for your time. I hope we speak again.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.